we're in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Now, if you would, hold your place there and turn to Proverbs chapter 13. I want to talk to you about a principle tonight that I think will be helpful for us to start with as we consider thinking through. You have quite a detailed outline, and I will just let you know that we did have all those subpoints up on the screen here until the whole thing vanished about 6:45 this afternoon. So anyhow, so we don't have all, we have the main points, but not all the subpoints, but you can write them in, you're smart people. But anyhow, thinking about being driven by a righteous desire, Proverbs 13, verse 12 says, "Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, but when the desire cometh, it is a tree of life." And what the proverb is saying is something we're all accustomed to, and that is, if we have something that we desire, but it keeps being denied, it makes us sick. We feel bad about it. Not necessarily sick like with a fever or cough or anything, but sick in the sense that you feel bad about it. You want it, but it's just not coming. And when it doesn't come, it just makes you feel really bad. And then, of course, the opposite is true at the end of the proverb, that when the desire does come, boy, you're happy. Yes, it's here, it's there, it's wonderful. Of course, we can relate that to Christmas when we were children, how children, but more than that, when things, you have a desire, a righteous desire, you desire someone to be saved. You have a burden for somebody's spiritual condition. You have a burden because you want the righteousness of God to prevail in our society. And yet it doesn't happen. It can just really wear on you. Well, that proverb in mind, I want you to go to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And understand, as we work through this chapter 1 and chapter 2, as we have time tonight, and just look at it, that Hannah was one that experienced both sides of that proverb. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the introduction of this study, so we're not going to go through that stuff again. I do want to show you this particular picture, if you don't mind. The very next picture, Brother Jimmy, if you would, please. Well, that's right, it's not there. It was on the other one, okay? All right, it was a picture of the tabernacle, okay? And so, but let's look at verse number, we're going to pick it up at verse number 4 this evening, okay? Verse number 4, after we went to the introduction about a couple of weeks ago, verse number 4 goes like this. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions. And notice a couple of things. First of all, this is one of his two wives. Also the fact that her number of children are quite significant, both male and female. So the emphasis in verse 4 is on the plurality or the size of her family. Verse 5, but unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And here you have the conflict. You have this situation. Now they've come to Shiloh, which I talked about in verse 3, and that's why I had the tabernacle there. It's where the tabernacle was for about 100 years during the time of the judges, okay? And of course Samuel, is going to be the last judge here. And so that's where people, and every couple of times a year, a few times a year, the people would come to worship. And so that's what they're talking about here. When they would come to worship in Shiloh to reflect their commitment to God and their acceptance of that, then they are going to worship God. And then he would give them offerings to give during that time. Now, in verses 4 to 8, I want to talk to you about, number 1, 4 points now. Number 1, the persistent desire. I want you to see that sometimes our desires are, though they're righteous, they are very quite persistent. So I want you to see 3 things underneath that. I think it's an ABC, I believe, in your outline. And letter A being this, the denial, in verses 4 to 6. Okay? And look, if you would, please, at verse 6. And her adversary. Now, who was her adversary? Who was Hannah's adversary? The other woman, okay? Told you a couple weeks ago, this idea of having more than one wife at one time is just not the right thing. It doesn't work well, okay? And their adversary also provoked her. Now, maybe because it talks about in verse 5, maybe how much that Hannah was loved by her husband. Maybe he loved her more than the other one, okay? I don't know all about that, but it would seem that may be the possibility here. But her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret because the Lord had shut up her womb. So that was every time this came up, it's like, okay? These are grown women, but it still happens, does it not? And there's this denial that is going over a significant period of time, okay? And you see that, the denial in verses 4 to 6. Second, you see the time in verse 7. And as he did so year by year, the idea here is quite a significant passing of time. So sometimes we have a persistent desire that is denied by God because notice it does say here in verse 6, why does she not have children? What's the reason why she does not have children? Because God said no. So this denial is from God because God said, no, you're not going to have the child right now. And that denial is there. And yet the time is over. And then the conflict. Okay, look at verse 8. And when Elkanah, her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? He's talking to her. And why eatest thou not? So she wasn't eating her food. And why is thy heart grieved? Now he's describing her. She's weeping. She's not eating. She's grieving. He says, am I not better than thee than 10 sons? Basically he's saying, what am I, chopped liver? I mean, I'm your husband. Why aren't I enough for you? Okay? And maybe if you're a woman, you say, well, that's probably pretty obvious. I don't know why, but there's a conflict. Let us see the conflict. Okay? So persistent desires are often accompanied with denial, with the passage of time, and with conflict when that need or that burden or that desire is not met. So that's something we have to expect. We have to understand. Now, why that's important is that all of us, from time to time, usually throughout our whole life, have some desires that are not being met at the moment. Very few of us, if any of us, I doubt really any of us, have all of our desires right now being met to the fullest extent that we wish they were. If you could do something different in your life right now, probably there'd be something you'd like to change, okay, at this moment. You may have a wonderful life, but there's probably some things if you could change, you would change, okay? Now, it is true that if you knew all that God knew, you wouldn't change a thing. But as far as God's working in your life, but maybe there's some things that you wish you would change. Now, here's the point, okay? That when we're denied, we have to understand, we have to deal with this reality. Which leads us to point number 2, and that is the prayer within the desire. In verses 9 through 18, how Hannah handled this is it drove her to prayer. But it is interesting that her prayer did not start at the very beginning of the process. Well, not this particular prayer, at least. Maybe she prayed before, but we don't have any record of it. But here, it drives her to significant focus on prayer. Verse 10, okay, verse 9 rather. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon the seat by the post of the temple of the Lord. So you have this tent that's there. You have the wall all the way around it. And then outside the tent, there'd be this place where evidently Eli was sitting. And she comes to the place of worship to pray. Okay? So you notice verse 10, her passion. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept. Now, why is that important? Her passion. Because sometimes what happens is we have passionate desires that we put in cold storage. Sometimes we are so tired of feeling so bad about what hasn't happened, we just choose to forget about it. We choose to put it in cold storage. We turn to wrap it up and put it off to the side because we don't want to be bothered by it, okay? We're tired of thinking about it. We're tired of worrying about it, okay? I think this really happens when it comes to people being having a burden for unsaved people. Because it's so hard to think of the person, if you're married, the person you sleep next to every night is one heartbeat away from a Christless eternity, or the children you gave birth to, okay, or your mom or dad. That certainly it's a very difficult thing to think about. And sometimes we distance ourselves from that desire and don't allow the pain of the desire to influence us, to move us to passionate prayer. We're just tired of it. We prayed about it for 10 days. God doesn't know anything about it. We prayed for it for 10 months, and God doesn't know anything about it. We prayed for it for 10 years, and nothing's going to change. Okay? Now, you could have made a reasonable case if you were talking to Hannah that night of saying, girl, you need to think this thing through. Got a fine man taking care of you. You got him. I know you got that other woman, but that's just tough luck on that one. But you got a fine man. And why not just enjoy the fine man who loves you and leave the burden alone? But she didn't. It was a righteous desire, but it was a driving righteous desire. And so she prayed passionately in verse 10. Then she prayed with specificity in verse 11. Now watch this. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaiden, and remember me, and not forget thy handmaiden, but will give unto thy handmaiden a man-child. Notice the specificity here. Notice the specificity with that she's acknowledging her complete dependence upon God. And with specificity, she is requesting a specific thing to happen. She's not trying to hedge around here. I'm asking this to happen. And then it says, then will I give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. So she's specific in the depth of her burden, and the nature of her request, and in the reality of her mindset. Okay? I want this child to be for you. So she's very specific. Let her see. Notice the continuance. It came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. Now this was not simply, now I lay me down to sleep and pray the Lord my soul to keep. Bless this food that you've given us, amen. This was a prayer that was continuing. It was driving her to unload her burden over a period of time. One of the reasons why we have a monthly day of prayer and fasting, and once a year a 3-day prayer and fasting, because often many of us are very busy day to day, and we maybe do a quick prayer in the morning, or we have limited time to pray in the morning. We need to understand that our prayers need to have a continuance to it, and here she's praying continually here tonight for that request. I thought this the other day. I wonder how many of us spend as much energy, as much focus on not catching, on reaching the lost, okay, or serving God as we do in not catching the coronavirus. I mean, does it consume our attention as much and our focus? Not that they shouldn't, but how focused are we on it? Here she is focused on this thing, and she's continuing. And then notice in verses 13 through 18, the faith-based, the faith foundation of her prayer. 13. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Wherefore Eli thought she had been drunken. So she, that's what what's wrong with this girl? She's not really praying. She's just being silly or being foolish. Verse 14, and Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away the wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. That's a beautiful expression, isn't it? Just poured out her heart before God. Sometimes when we have a pressing burden, a pressing driving desire that's not being met over a elongated time, we become weary and well-doing. We don't pour out our heart before the Lord. Verse 16, count not thy handmaiden as a daughter of Belial, referring to the devil, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken unto thee. Notice again how she expresses her emotions, her feelings, her thinking, my complaint and my grief. I am really brokenhearted. But we sometimes don't like the comfort of the pain that comes from a driving righteous desire. Why? Let's just turn something on TV. Let's have a piece of chocolate. Let's just move on and do something fun. Now, I'm not saying there are times to do things like that, but we have to be careful that we don't shortchange ourselves by not personally, privately, passionately, specifically pouring our burdens out to the Lord. And that's what she does. Verse 17, then Eli answered and said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. Now that's the promise from the prophet that God's going to answer. And she said, let thy handmaiden find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way, now watch this, did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. And notice the faith base. She knew that now God is going to work here. She trusted God to work. You say, well, that'd be great. I wish I had a prophet that would give me that answer. Well, I understand the feeling there. That's true. But she did have the faith. And her faith is not just seen in verse 18 by how she responds when the prophet says you're going to get the baby. Her faith was seen in verses 13 to 17 as she honestly pours her heart out to God. Okay? That's like when was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego successful? When they walked out of the flame, or when they were allowed themselves to be thrown into the flame? You see, where was the faith manifest? And she's manifesting her faith by coming to God and pouring it out, and then publicly acknowledging what she's doing. Okay, so you see the prayer within the desire, and then you see that unfold, okay? And then letter number 3, the propriety throughout the desire, okay? So the propriety. So now that I have this desire, and God now has given me a sense of direction, and that's how I would equate this. And she had the desire, and she unburdened it. She laid it out there. It was persistent in verses 4 to 8, and then she lays it out there in prayer. Now she has a sense of direction. Now, the reality is for most of us, when we have an abiding burden, there are some times when God gives us a clear sense that this is going to work if we do this or that or the other. But many times we don't, but we do have a sense of God's leading, okay? That God will lead us in a certain way. And when you have a persistent desire and you have poured your heart out with God, and God has given you some clear leadership, then there needs to be a proper response to that leadership, okay? You've got to act on what God's told you. And you have to be careful. Never forget, there was a fine young man in our church in Raleigh, and he stood up one time and he said his wife was battling an illness. He says, God has told me that he is going to heal my wife. And I didn't say anything. I said, well, God bless you, my brother. I didn't, he didn't say he had a vision or anything like that, but he was claiming this healing, which never happened. Okay, she passed away. You got to be careful that you don't claim what God hasn't shown you. You have to be careful, because sometimes when we have a persistent burden and we start giving up hope, we start reaching for straws, and we start saying, okay, well, let me find some promise of God to hold on to. Well, remember, it's only a promise of God in the Word if it is contextually accurate. You can't take any promise in the God. Have you ever heard the song, every promise in the book is mine? You ever heard that chorus? How do the words go? Every promise in the book is mine. Every word, every something, every line, I think. Something like that. Anybody remember the song? No? Every what? Every word, every truth, every line. Okay? Now I have a question. Is that actually true? And it's not really true. Okay? It's not true. Yeah. It's like the promise, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, they will hear from heaven and heal their land. That is a promise given in the Old Testament to the nation of Israel. Okay? It's not a promise that can be held on to and say, now does that mean that God can't answer our prayer and give us people in leadership that would love him? He can. But I can't hold on to a promise in the Old Testament. And where the health, wealth, and prosperity people go off track often is going to the Old Testament, finding a promise that God made to Israel as a nation and apply it to all of us in 2020. And you can't do that. You have to understand the promise has got to be understood contextually. Okay? But once you get a sense of God's leading, you have to move forward. That's what happens in verse 19. Look at verse 19. Okay, first of all, you have an acknowledging of the work of God. Look at letter A, the acknowledging of the work of God. Look at verse 19. And they rose up in the morning early and worshiped before the Lord and returned and came to the house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah, which means they had natural relationships as husband and wife. And the Lord remembered her. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, and they called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. And so she now here, in letter A, she acknowledges the work of God. So she's saying, now this is what God has done. God has done this. So when I'm working through my desires and I've had this persistent burden, I've prayed about it, and God has given me a sense of leadership, that I move forward with my acknowledging that my dependence is upon Him and accepting what He is doing. Because God is doing stuff that you and I don't always understand, but sometimes we do see it, and here she saw it, and she acknowledges what God is doing. Okay? Letter B, she enjoyed the blessing of God. Now, that is proper. It is proper to acknowledge God's work in your life. It's also appropriate to enjoy the blessings of God. Verse 21, and Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. And then will I bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. Okay? And the idea of staying there. Verse 23, and her husband said unto her, do what seemeth thee good. Tarry until thou hast weaned him. Only the Lord established his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. Now what is she doing? Well, she is taking advantage of the time that she does have, and I'm assuming enjoying her son. Okay? Those first couple of 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 years. Okay? Depending on the situation. So she is enjoying what God has done for her. All right? So I want to encourage you about something, that when God's working in your life, okay, don't be afraid to acknowledge what God has done. Second, don't be afraid to enjoy what God has given you. Sometimes we have the weird idea that if we're enjoying ourselves, we simply must not be doing the right thing. It's not always true. Sometimes it can be true, but not always. In fact, we ought to enjoy the blessings of God upon our lives, okay? And understand that this, now she knew, now watch this, she knew the time was going to come, he's going to leave, okay? But she focused on the time that she had with him, okay? Letter C, she was faithful to the call of God. Verse 24, and when she had weaned him, she took him up with her and 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour, and about, she's coming up with the offering there to the Lord. And in verse 25, they slew the bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee and prayed unto the Lord. So evidently there's no indication that Eli would have known. He didn't get a text. He didn't get a letter, evidently. And she comes, introduces herself, verse 27, for this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given him me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Now, this is one of the bases that we often have in churches. I've done it over the years numbers of times, where you have what's called baby dedication, where a young couple will bring their child forward during the invitation, and there'll be a prayer of blessing upon that child. And the parents are acknowledging that this is a gift from God and that they are stewards of this child's life, okay? But here she is faithful to the demands upon her life. She goes and she puts the child there. So she is faithful. So how do I properly respond when God has given me directions? A, I acknowledge the work that God has done. B, I enjoy whatever blessings he may give me. And number 3, I am faithful to the call of God upon my life. Number 4, the final one, is the praise from the desire. In chapter 2, verses 1 down to verse 11, you have Hannah's prayer or her song. Some call it a hymn. It is interesting that the book of Samuel, remember from a couple of weeks ago, the book of Samuel was originally just one book, okay, and it's divided up later. It's one book. And so it begins with a song of Hannah, and it ends with whose song? Do you know? It ends with the song of David. And so it begins with a song, it ends with a song or a praise, and here you have the praise in verses 1 through 11. I'll give this to you very quickly. I know we have a meeting tonight, and I want to give this to you and make sure you think it through. Okay? So the praise from the desire. And the praise, I outlined it in 3 notations. Letter A, the uniqueness of God. The uniqueness of God. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth is enlarged over my enemies because I rejoice." That enemy there would be, I guess, is the other woman. Okay, verse 2. "And there is none holy as the Lord. There's none besides thee." Notice what she's doing. She is magnifying the uniqueness of God. Okay? I think we have to be careful that we don't assume in our prayers, in our praises, but God already knows what he's like. We need to acknowledge what God is like. One of the most wonderful books, very small book, but a wonderful book that you could be well advised to get sometimes, is called The Knowledge of the Holy by Tozer. It's a wonderful book that magnifies multiple qualities about God. And each of the little paragraphs begin with a prayer that magnifies a particular character about God. I read a part of the chapter today on the goodness of God, that God is good. And so she's acknowledging the uniqueness of God in verses 1 to 2. And then in verses 3 through 8, she acknowledges the victory is from God. "Talk no more so exceedingly proudly. Let not arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is God of knowledge, and by his actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and they that stumble are girded with strength." And he's referring here in verses 3 down to verse 8 that this is God is working. Verse 6, "The Lord killeth and maketh alive. He bringeth down the grave and bringeth up." She's acknowledging that this was all a working from God. Verse 7, the Lord maketh poor and maketh rich. He bringeth low and he lifteth up. He raised up the poor. In verse 8, he raised up the poor out of the dust and lifted up the beggar from the dunghill. It is God that brings the victory. And there's an acknowledgement that when something is working, when something is successful, the need is met, the work is done, that God has done it. She's praising him for that. I think sometimes we are become accustomed to God working in our lives, and we don't thank him and praise him for even the simplest things that he does for us and his regular blessings upon our life. But here she's praising him for the victory. And this is acknowledging, let us see the provision from God in verses 9 down to verse 11. I'm just going to talk about one of them right now, verse 11. "And he will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness. For by strength shall no man prevail." He's acknowledging not only the uniqueness of God and the victory is from God, but the provision of God to be there and to give what is needed. And this song of praise magnifies this uniqueness, this victory, and this provision that comes from God. So here's a question I want to leave you with, okay? Is there a persistent burden in your life, a righteous desire that you have put in cold storage, that you've just packed away? Because it's been too difficult for you to face it on a persistent basis. It has bothered you so much, so it's just better just to forget about it and just accept it. Now, if God has told you, if God has answered that desire with clarity, that it's not going to change, so you have to accept it. You can't be like the young boy who was in the car accident and he was heard praying in the back of the police car, "Lord, I pray that this accident will not have happened." You can't do that. You can't pray that time goes backwards. It's not going to happen. So yeah, if God has led you to accept a desire and that it's not going to be met, or accept the situation that's not going to be altered, then you accept it and you move on. But if you really haven't gotten clear direction from God yet, and you simply are tired of praying about it because it hasn't happened yet, why is that? Why are you allowing the difficulty of the burden to withhold you from seeking God to work in that burden and to change that situation? So how can I function? Well, she functioned. Go back, if you don't mind, just one more just observation where it says that this came year by year, early on in chapter 1, where they went up, verse 7, and so he did so year by year. We don't have many years, but enough years for Peninnah to have like multiple men, sons and daughters. So let's assume they were married at the same time. I don't know when they were married, but so she's had multiple sons and multiple daughters, which takes multiple years. Okay, and so she had but she didn't give up on her burden. She didn't give up on her desire. I think sometimes when we get to a point in our Christian life over a period of time, we can become weary in well-doing. I know people, for example, who have loved ones, and when the church has an event, they used to ask them all the time, but they don't ask them anymore because they always say no. They always say no. They're never going to come. They're never going to come. They're never going to respond. Well, they might never respond, but they're definitely not going to respond if you don't ask them. Okay? You say, well, it's not going to change. I'm stuck. I'm just stuck in this thing. I just can't. Well, maybe, but maybe God would change it if we prayed about it. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. So let's take our burdens to the Lord and leave them there and then follow his direction for our lives. The second thing I ask you is this. If you have a righteous desire that's driving you, and you're praying about it right now, okay, are you allowing the absence of an answer to date to weaken your resolve and to weaken your contentment? Okay? Let's be careful that we don't accept the drive of a righteous desire as an excuse to be discontent with the momentary experience that God has for us right now. So I'm to have this desire and pray and seek God's work at the time that I am content and satisfied with God's will for my life. So that's a combination that we need to understand.